Good evening. I am Julie Rowein, the president of the League of Women Voters of Concord-Carlisle. On behalf of our league, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's discussion of police reform legislation. Our guests tonight are Senator Mike Barrett, who represents the 3rd Middlesex District, and Representative Tami Gouveia, who represents the 14th Middlesex District. Our moderator this evening is Stefan Bader, who is a member of the League of Women Voters of Concord-Carlisle. This evening's discussion has been organized by our newly formed Racial Justice Committee, which is particularly concerned with policing and public safety. Since our founding in 1920, the League of Women Voters has worked to foster civic engagement and to enhance access to voting. The League is a nonpartisan organization and does not support or oppose any candidate or political party. The first part of this evening is being recorded and will be available on our website, but the recording will not include the question and answer session. And I will now turn over the proceedings to Stefan.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone. I want to extend a particular welcome to our league members from league chapters beyond Concord-Carlisle. I see a number of them here from surrounding towns that are in Senator Barrett's or Representative Gouveia's district. Thank you for joining us tonight too. So this forum is going to talk about police reform, public safety reform, and related topics. And I think we'll open it up with brief statements from Senator Barrett and then Representative Gouveia. So I will turn it over to you, Senator Barrett. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, very pleased to be here, Stefan. Thank you. And especially pleased to be joined by Dr. Tami Gouveia, who is a possessor of a PhD and has been working hard toward that, even as she's been a dynamite legislator. So I don't know how you do it. You're a mom too, but wonderful to have you formally ensconced in doctorate land.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Tami and I are in a period where criminal and law enforcement reform is currently before a conference committee, as I think listeners perhaps are aware. The Senate passed a strong bill. The House passed a strong bill. There are differences though, and procedurally, we now have 3 senators chaired by Will Brownsberger, the state senator from Belmont, and 3 House members. And I think, who's the House chair of the 3 conferees on your side?
Claire Cronin.
That's right, Representative Cronin from Easton, Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So 6 people, 2 Republicans, 4 Democrats, have to take the House bill and the Senate bill and reconcile the differences. Occasionally that's not possible at all, and a deadline comes and goes and no product ensues. I don't think that's going to be the case here. I think the 2 branches are close enough together so that we are going to see a very serious bill to address the conduct of policing in Massachusetts. We've extended the session this year, the first time that's ever been done, in recognition not only of COVID, but in recognition of the pendency of important issues like law enforcement reform. So technically, there is a generous deadline now confronting the 6 members of the conference committee on this issue. We could actually see a conference committee as late as Tuesday, January 5th, 2021, because new legislatures, the ones we're going to elect this November, Tami and I are both on the ballot, are take their seats the first Wednesday of the new year. That happens, I think, to be January 6th. So in theory, a conference committee on law enforcement could report the evening of January 5th. And it would still be timely, and we would still be able to enact a statute. Presumably, this conference committee is not going to take that long. I view the issues before us, very broadly speaking, as twofold. First of all, we want to regulate police conduct, and we want to be very tough on instances of police misconduct when they're established. But the bill looks beyond that and wants to reduce the footprint of policing in a modern United States state, in modern Massachusetts. So We are addressing instances of police misconduct, but we're also trying to address the oversized position that law enforcement plays in the United States and in our particular part of the United States. Policing looms larger here, and police forces are better staffed here than in almost any other democracy on the face of the earth. We're trying to ask the question, why? Why are police departments so big? What is it about the culture here that suggests that we can't be like any European nation? We certainly can't be like Canada either. We've got to have, relatively speaking, a huge proportion of our available resources at the local level devoted to law enforcement. So we're addressing the footprint issue, but also the police conduct and misconduct issue. With regard to the latter, we really focus in both the House and the Senate on this issue of police use of force. When is the use of force reasonable? When is it unreasonable? And what do you do in instances where you determine that it is unreasonable? I don't need to tell anyone listening this evening that in the United States, localities and the state of Massachusetts have a real hard time making the call and seeing justice done in instances of allegations of police misconduct. It's a tough one, and we've done a bad job in terms of figuring out how to isolate that bad behavior and then truly punish it. I think the two bills here have the right general idea. We create something called a POSAC, Police Officer Standards and Accreditation Committee. It's not the name that's of interest here. This POSAC will be a quasi-judicial body at the state level that can take complaints about police misconduct from any locality within the Commonwealth, can consider the facts, can use their subpoena power to bring witnesses before it, and can decide if police have engaged in excessive uses of force. And we've defined, by the way, all kinds of standards that we would like POSAC to impose on all of us. Uses of tear gas, uses of police dog, uses of chokehold, absolutely prohibited. And the concept of the use of force is itself now subject to a legal definition that this decision-making body can really apply to the facts that come before it. The penalties, if a police officer is found to have engaged in excessive force, are permanent decertification because, and this is something I'd be interested to hear from league members about, the instrument we create here is similar to what already exists for lawyers like me or for physicians, actually also for cosmetologists. We have state boards that provide licensing. I've got the Board of Bar Overseers. There's a Board of Practice in Medicine. There's a State Board of Practice in Nursing and in cosmetology and a whole host of other things. The license you get when you become a professional in one of these domains can be taken away from you in instances of misbehavior. And this is in addition to what punishment you might get imposed on you if you break a law, a criminal law, I mean. It's in addition to any punishment or penalty you may pay if someone sues you for misconduct. The state licensing function stands apart and is an alternative way to see justice done. Let's say in the case of a lawyer who absconds with your money, or in the case of a physician who commits negligence or abuses a patient in some way. We're creating that kind of state licensing function for cops. So when I tell you that there are unprecedented steps being taken here to discipline those rare but incredibly regrettable instances of police misconduct, what I'm saying is that we're giving every law enforcement officer a license, but we're reserving the right to take it away. And if, and you have rights, by the way, to contest any effort to take it away, but if you do lose your license to practice after you've been given the right to an attorney, given the right to challenge witnesses against you, given the right to testify in your own defense, if you're a police officer and you lose this license, you can never again practice or be a police officer anywhere in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You can't go to the next town over. If you're a state cop, you can't go to work for local police departments. You're done. So this is a deadly serious, to borrow a metaphor that occasionally pops up in law enforcement, a very, very serious effort to define what we mean by good conduct and bad. And in those instances where bad conduct is found, to be very, very tough. I want to yield the podium to Tami. So I won't, in these opening remarks, talk about particular defenses that law enforcement officers can raise in instances where they're accused of misconduct. The defense of qualified immunity, for example, has become a hot discussion topic. I'm very proud to say that the Senate's pretty tough here. The Senate essentially creates a reasonableness standard in instances of the application of qualified immunity. You can continue to raise it if your conduct is what a reasonable person would have done in the circumstances of the case, but you cannot raise the defense if your conduct is found by POSAC to be unreasonable. Introducing this reasonable person rule, and lawyers do that all the time in different cases, into this area sharply limits the qualified immunity defense. And I think it needed to be tamped back. It had basically grown over the years through a series of unconnected court decisions to essentially be a get out of jail free card, even for the worst acting law enforcement officer. That get out of jail free card will go by the board if the Senate language on qualified immunity is adopted by the conferees on this conference committee. But we can talk more about that later. I look forward to hearing Tami's remarks. I want to thank you, Stephen, again for having us. Nothing, as we've heard, because of a shooting in Wisconsin today, you've all told me about, nothing sadly could be more timely than what we're discussing tonight.
Well, thank you again for joining us, Senator Barrett. And I'm hoping as well that we can continue, maybe have some more sessions like this on this or other topics as this legislation develops and as other topics come along. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the microphone over to Representative Gouveia. Now I'm told Dr. Gouveia. Congratulations, Tami.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Julie, thank you for inviting me. Stefan, thank you for moderating. I'm so proud and glad to share the space with all of you and with Senator Barrett as well. I think, since this is going to be shared with other folks, just sort of some top level comments about police brutality and police reform. Just want to say a few things before we perhaps dig into the mechanics of some of the questions. As it so happens, the doctorate that I just am wrapping up is a doctorate in public health, and I focused on non-arrest policies for illicit opioid use and addiction. And there's a lot of real juicy stuff that came out of my research, which I had to sort of refocus in response to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Officer Chauvin. And it's really a relevant conversation for what the conversation that I hope we have here tonight. I know that this is being put on by, I might get the exact name of your group wrong, but the Racial Justice Subcommittee. So I do think that there's an opportunity for us to have a much more in-depth ongoing conversation, which I've tried to start up in the 14th Middlesex District anyways. And that is that police enforce the laws that we pass at the State House. That's one important takeaway. But their interpretation of how to do that is really very broad and left very wide open. And while I do think that the efforts of the police reform bill that we took up in the House and the Senate are really positive, important first steps, it doesn't end at all. It's not the end all be all of where we need to take this conversation around race and racism and honestly white supremacy in our country and the institutions that are really held together by white supremacy, and we just don't know it, and conceptions of whiteness that are invisible to so many of us because it's not necessarily anything that we've taken the time or had the opportunity to reflect on. And I think that the murder of George Floyd gives us a unique opportunity, a really critical, maybe not unique, but a really critical opportunity for us to really change the status quo and change the ways that we do business in our country and in our state when it comes to the ways that we treat people and treat other people. And so I'd like to start with that concept of the fact that police enforce the laws that we pass and this broad conception, because there is a really important component where community members make phone calls or take steps that then put police in a position where they are having to show up at a party where a person of color lives, or someone picking up trash on the side of the road and they look suspicious and they look like they don't belong in our communities. My boyfriend, who I live with, is a 24-year police officer in Acton, and I hear from him stories all the time of how community members call the police and say, this person looks like they don't belong here. And so as community members, we put our police officers in this real sticky position oftentimes. It's kind of similar to what happened with Amy Cooper and Chris Cooper in New York City. And those things are happening right here in our own district and in our own state over and over and over again. I'm not saying they happen in our community over and over again, but certainly they are happening in our state very regularly. And I do think that's an important component of this conversation around police brutality. And a lot of it has to do with perceptions as well. I talk to folks in town who feel really pained about not wanting to upset the police officers that they know and that they respect and that they think are doing a really good job in our community. And that complicates things. We have personal relationships with people who serve our town and have served our towns for a very long time. But I think it's important for us to also look at the data. And this is one of the things that came through really clearly for me in my dissertation, is that when I talk to white people about the perceptions around opioid use, the perception still is that it's primarily affecting white communities, and that's no longer the case and has not been the case for a good 5 years. But we're still so stuck on, who is affected by this particular opioid epidemic. And it's the same thing that happens when you talk about police brutality. And people of color have been talking about police brutality for literally decades. But we didn't necessarily, as predominantly white community or predominantly white people on this call, let's acknowledge that, right? We didn't necessarily think about those things or reflect on those things, or, it has to sometimes be just so clearly in your face before you can really tune in and listen to the experiences that other people have been trying to share with us. And that does play into why we are where we are in the State House focused on police brutality. I'm friendly with members of the Black and Latino caucus, so I know a little bit of some of the conversations that they've had with the Speaker of the House around, and it's particularly with the people who filed the legislation, the key legislation that ended up in the House version. They've been filing those pieces of legislation for years. It's not brand new legislation. And so a lot of the pushback we got from police, particularly police chiefs, I'll be honest, like they were the hardest ones to contend with as a state representative. And same for the hands-free driving bill. It was a lot of, perspectives that were coming forth that were, had to take a step back and really listen to what they were saying, what they were sharing. But part of the messaging was, well, we didn't have time. This is brand new legislation. That's not accurate at all. And that's an important point here. My colleagues of color have been trying to beat the drum around this for a long time. And it took the murder of George Floyd for people to pay attention. I'm incredibly grateful that we are focused on this in a way that we haven't been before. I just hope that we don't say, well, we passed police reform, now let's go back to business as usual and call it a day. One of the things that I've been concerned about since the beginning of us talking about police reform in the State House is that as white people, are we scapegoating police and blaming them for the racism that we are all part of, and white supremacy that we're all part of upholding? And so by scapegoating police and saying, well, it's their problem, it's their responsibility, once we fix that problem, we're all off the hook and everybody can go back to feeling really good about themselves. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. Massachusetts has one of the worst income inequality rates in the whole country, and a lot of it is driven by race. Our opioid epidemic is also in many ways more recently being driven by race. And so if we want to really have a just society and the kind of state that we all really, everybody can really be proud of, then it's really important that we continue to have the conversation and take it a step further. Just a couple things that I want to share, just so that we have a little bit of statistics at your fingertips, and for people who are listening, and we can talk more about this in our conversation if we'd like. But when you look at, and when people ask police, is the death of Black individuals in particular through encounters with police, is it a systemic issue or is it an isolated incident? And people of color resoundingly will say it's a systemic issue. It's not just what happens in our interactions with police. But when you ask all officers, and this is a study done by Pew 3 years ago, 67% of officers think it's just an isolated incident. So we think we're all looking at the same problem. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this analogy of like looking at an elephant and someone's over and they're touching the tail and it feels like bristles, and someone's touching the trunk and it feels like a tree trunk. And then, someone's touching the bristles and it feels like something else. Like everybody has their perception of what this real big, hairy problem is. And it's much bigger than just the one slice that people are looking at. And so when I read these kinds of statistics where there's just a wide gap in how people from different professions or backgrounds see the same problem, it says to me that we have a lot of relationship building work to do and a lot of conversation to have, not just within groups where it feels comfortable and safe, but to really have those conversations with people who, might differ from us. And among white officers, it's even higher. It's 72% see police brutality in cases where an African-American has been, harmed by a police officer as just an isolated incident and not part of a larger system. And so it's sort of like the analogy of, your boiling frog, right? That whole analogy. I'm not great with analogies, nor am I great with jokes, but it's just, I think it's just something important for us to understand, is that we are looking at these issues very differently. And while public policy is really important, it's a much bigger culture shift that I think is, before us. And I think it does go back to something that Senator Barrett said too. It's about, this larger conversation of, why have the police had so much put on their laps? It's the same conversation around, why do our teachers have so much put on our laps? It's the same reason, why didn't we close down schools with COVID right away? Because the conversation at the State House was, how are we going to make sure that kids can be fed? We have literally hundreds of feeding sites across the state because our children don't have enough food in their own homes. That is a real problem for us to be taking a look at. And all of these systems really, in my mind and in my perspective, really interact and intersect in ways that I think we need to start to understand those intersections and start to pull them apart. And they're related, right? We dump so many on the places of where people are trusted, usually our teachers, our police officers, in many instances. And we've dumped so much on them and have not invested in the social services and the wraparound services that we need. So all of that's part of this conversation. And I know that's huge to take on in this next 40 minutes or so, but I wanted to set that context and that frame because that's how I'm coming into this particular conversation. So thank you for all of that. And Stefan?
Thank you, Representative Gouveia.